ISO is to simply mount this to whatever machine you would like to deploy Veeam on. In this case, once you mount the ISO, you can open up the directory and you'll see several folders as well as a setup file. Now, this is going to be the application to start the auto run sequence. So if you double click on setup, it may prompt you to allow this service to run. So you simply hit yes if UAC is still enabled. And from here, you're going to arrive at the splash screen. Now, the splash screen has several different useful resources on it, including the largest block here will be to start the installation, which we'll get to in just a moment. But you also have shortcuts to additional documentation. You even have a link to training resources. So if you click on this training link, this will actually take you out to Veeam.com, where once you log on, you can actually take advantage of free online training to get more up to speed with how to use Veeam once you deploy it. Now, over on the right-hand side, you'll see some standalone components, such as the Enterprise Manager, Backup and Replication Console, as well as Enterprise Application Plugins. Now, the Enterprise Manager is a very useful component that enables you to manage multiple Veeam backup and replication servers if you are deploying Veeam across multiple sites. It's also very important if you want to take advantage of encryption. This will give you a second level password retrieval mechanism. Additionally, if you want the ability to search and restore guest files, say for an example, Word documents, PDF documents, you will need the Enterprise Manager installed in order to activate that search and restore. And lastly, to touch on the actual console itself, the console can be deployed on any Windows machine separate from the Veeam server. So for an example, you could install the console by itself on your laptop machine and actually remote into your Veeam backup and replication server so that you can manage it from your local system as opposed to connecting to the Veeam server directly through remote desktop services. So let's get started with the installation. It's very straightforward and it's wizard driven. So when you click install, this will begin the installation process. Once the installer has finished initializing, the first screen that you'll be greeted with is the license agreement. Make sure you read through this thoroughly and then check the box to accept the terms of the Veeam license agreement. And also make sure you check the box to accept terms for third-party components. And if you want to view the license agreements for those third-party components, there's a button to the right where you can click View to see those terms. Now the next screen is going to be where you provide your license file. If you have your license file readily available, simply hit Browse and locate it. If you do not apply a license at this stage, Veeam will operate in the Community Edition, which has a limit of up to 10 workloads. So keep in mind, if no license file is applied, you will have a maximum protection scope of 10. In this case, we're not going to apply a license and hit Next. And the next screen that this is going to land you on are the different program features. Now, more times than not, the defaults on this screen will be sufficient. If you need to change the installation path, you can simply hit Browse and redirect the install to another location if necessary. Now, the next screen we're going to arrive at is a system configuration check. Now, what the Veeam installer has gone out and done is checked the necessary requirements on this system to see if it meets the minimum system requirements for Veeam to be installed. And as you can see, there are a few different server features and roles that are not currently active, as well as some that have passed the check. Now, what's very easy about this installation wizard is you simply hit install and Veeam will go out and instruct Windows to add those roles and features so that it will now meet the minimum system requirements for Veeam to be installed. Now you can see that installation process has completed and brought this particular machine up to minimum spec so that Veeam can be deployed. Now the next screen that we've arrived at is a very important step before we start the installation. And what you'll see under the default configuration is the install path, the vPower cache folder. Now, the explanation of what the vPower cache folder is for is a redo log. So essentially, whenever we start instant VM recovery, where we're running VMs directly from backup files, there has to be a location where the redirected writes are stored, and that is going to be this NFS data store. Now, as you can tell, it actually selected a different drive letter. So on this particular machine, there are two drives. We have a system disk, and we also have a V drive, which is going to be our repository. So Veeam is intelligent enough to know that that particular drive has the most available free space, and it's also not the system disk. Because what will happen is when you're running instant VM recoveries, that will grow until you finalize the instant VM recovery. So the last thing that you would want to have happen is that to be also on your C drive, which could potentially fill up while an instant VM recovery is running. So it's critical to pay attention to that. If that were to be on your system disk, you may want to modify that location. Now you also see the guest catalog folder. This is where Veeam stores the catalog if you enable guest file system indexing. Okay, notice that also dropped it on the V drive. You'll see some other details around port numbers, and also another very important part is the SQL Server row. So by default, Veeam will deploy a SQL Server Express instance onto this machine with a given database name of Veeam Backup. Now, for most deployments, if it's going to be a small deployment, that might be adequate. But a couple things to consider is SQL Server Express has a maximum database size of 10 gigabytes. So if you're running things like Exchange servers, SharePoint servers, or farms that could have databases that are over 10 gig in size, be aware that when you go to launch our Veeam Explorers, you may run up against a maximum database size limit issue where you're not able to mount it because it's larger than 10 gigabyte. So there are workarounds for that, such as staging servers. But if you do have the ability to just deploy Veeam to a full SQL instance, it might be easier at this stage to simply relocate where the database backend lives. And if you do need to make modifications, notice we have a checkbox to let me specify different settings. So if we do not check this box, Veeam will do the default installation. But let's go ahead and check the box to explain the different options that you have available. So the next screen is going to be the service account. Now, by default, it's going to use a local system account, and that's generally recommended. However, if you have already created a service account specifically for Veeam Actions, you can specify the following user account and then populate it. Now, in this case, we're going to leave the default. Also notice, install new instance of SQL Server. This is going to be the SQL Server Express instance. If you have a full-blown SQL deployment that you would rather use, you'll want to change this option to use the existing instance of SQL Server and then browse to locate it, as well as specify a database name if you need to change the naming scheme. And then down at the bottom, notice you have authentication. So whether or not you're going to use Windows authentication or SQL Server authentication. Now in this case, we're going to leave everything on the default. The next screen is going to be port configuration. If you need to modify certain ports for whatever the reason, you do have the ability to change these for the catalog service, backup service, as well as secure connections port. So there's 3 options that you do have the ability to adjust if necessary. And then like I mentioned a moment ago, you've got the vPower NFS target and the guest file system catalog target. If you do need to modify where these locations reside, you've got browse buttons on each of these, so you can redirect it if necessary. And finally, we've arrived at a very similar screen than what we saw just a moment ago. And this is circling back, showing us the settings that we've adjusted because we checked that box to make modifications. Now, the last thing that you'll see at the bottom is a checkbox that is checked by default. Check for updates once the product is installed and periodically. And this will phone home to Veeam servers to see if there's any hot fixes or patches or even software updates that need to be installed. This is not required, however, so if you do have a Veeam server offline, you may choose to decheck this box if the Veeam server, for security reasons, does not have internet access. We're going to leave it on as the default, and then we're going to hit install. Now at this point, just sit back and let the Veeam wizard do its thing. It's going to go through, and if you chose the default SQL Server Express path like we did, it's going to deploy SQL Server Express in its entirety. It's going to add that database, and then it will go back and install Veeam. Now, the one important piece that we'll finish this video with is the Enterprise Manager is a very integral part of Veeam Backup and Replication. And if you do need to install Enterprise Manager, it's a separate installation. It's not automatically installed after backup and replication finishes. So we'll circle back to that splash screen and deploy Enterprise Manager and show you the options there as well. And that concludes the installation of backup and replication. So once you hit finish on this wizard, you'll be prompted with the splash screen once again. Now, like I mentioned a moment ago, at this point, it's highly recommended if you have Veeam Backup Enterprise Manager available with your Veeam license, you definitely want to install this as well. So we're going to walk through the steps real quickly to install Enterprise Manager. And remember, some key value adds that it can bring to you is the ability to leverage the guest file system indexing. So you can search for a very specific file and do an in-place restore. It also enables self-service options as well as a second tier password retrieval capability if you're using Veeam encryption. So to start the installation process, you simply click on Install. Okay, just like the installation of backup and replication, the first screen that you'll be prompted with is to read through and accept the Veeam license agreement as well as third-party components agreement. Once you have read those and accepted the terms, you simply hit Next, and then it will prompt you for the license file. Now, this is going to be the same license file that you've used to install Veeam Backup and Replication. Notice at this point, you do have to provide a license file in order to use Enterprise Manager. So that is going to be one requirement. You cannot use this on Veeam Community Edition. So now all you have to do is click Browse and locate your license file, which we're going to apply that and hit Next. And once you applied your license file, the next step is to set up the program features. Now, by default, you're going to have Veeam Backup Enterprise Manager. You'll also notice that the Cloud Connect portal for service providers is an option, but it's X'd out and not going to be installed. So this is only going to be relevant if you're a member of our Veeam Cloud and Service Provider ecosystem, where you actually need that Cloud Connect portal. So typically, you can just accept the defaults and hit Next. Now, the only other option on this screen is to change the installation location. So perhaps if originally when you installed backup and replication, if you went to another directory with that deployment, you may want to have this match that target location. So if that's the case, simply click Browse and locate the new destination. Okay, the next screen, like before, is going to do a system configuration check. So just like when we deployed backup and replication, it went through and did a comparison to see which role and feature was currently enabled on the system and which one that Veeam required. And if it was a missing component, Veeam would tell Windows to go ahead and add that role or feature. Same thing is true here because there are going to be different requirements for Backup Enterprise Manager. And as you can see on this particular machine, we've only got a couple of required roles and features already installed. So again, the nice thing about this deployment wizard is all you do is hit install, and Veeam will tell Windows exactly which roles and features that we need activated in order to successfully deploy Backup Enterprise Manager. Okay, now that all those roles and features have been installed, you can see everything is now showing as passed. Okay, so once you hit Next and go to the next screen, this is going to ask you about your service account credentials. Now, like before, the default is going to be a local system account, and that's generally what's recommended. However, if you do want to specify a service account, this gives you an option to do that setting change here. You would simply click this button and then browse or manually type in that service account along with a corresponding password. We're going to leave it on the default local system for this case. And you'll notice that this is also going to look for the Veeam SQL Server instance that you deployed before. Now, the default generally would be to deploy SQL Server Express, but you can see install new instance is now grayed out because we just did that in the previous step when we installed backup and replication. So that's why you're going to see use existing instance of SQL Server, and that's what we just deployed a few moments ago when we deployed backup and replication. Now, generally speaking, this is going to match whatever SQL deployment you used before, but if for whatever reason you need to relocate this, you could browse to a different instance and then type in the database name if you need to name it something other than the default. And then lastly, below, just like before, whether or not you want to use Windows authentication or SQL Server authentication. We're going to leave all this on the default and hit Next. Now, the next screen you come to is a few additional configuration parameters. A lot of this deals with certain port numbers if you do need to make modifications here, such as the RESTful API access port. There's a lot of different configuration options here based on your networking schematic and requirements. So make sure if you do need to veer away from the defaults, you know exactly what you're changing and make a note of it. And you also have the ability to change the certificate setting. So the default is to simply generate a new self-signed certificate. But if you do have other certs that you'd like to use, you can click this drop down and view a list of those. And if you click on one and want to view, you can simply click View Certificate. Now in this case, we're going to leave it on the default and generate a new self-signed. And lastly, you've got an option whether or not you want to enable high security mode, which will force TLS 1.2 usage, and it will also disable weak ciphers. So when you hit next, this is the last screen. There's nothing else to change at this point. This is just a review of all the settings that you're about to apply. And when you hit install, just like before, Veeam is going to go out automatically and deploy all the necessary components to stand up the Veeam Enterprise Manager. Okay, now that the installation process is complete, you're finished installing Veeam Backup and Replication as well as the Enterprise Manager. You're now ready to go through the setup process. Thank you so much for watching this video and stay tuned for more.